everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. It's May 2020, and you're listening to episode 181, which is a conversation about the teachings of author, TED Talk speaker, and university professor Brené Brown. On this episode, I'm joined by Ann Kennedy, who has an MDiv and is the author of Nailed It, 365 Sarcastic Devotions for Angry and Worn Out People. Ann blogs about current events and theological trends at Preventing Grace on Patheos.com. Ann has written an online exclusive feature article for the Christian Research Journal, and it's called, But What If It Is Me? The Work and Worldview of Brené Brown. You can read her article for free online at our website, equip.org. Ann, it's good to have you on.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, Ann has written an article for us, as I mentioned, about Brené Brown. And, I wasn't really familiar with her up until recently, but I was at a Christian women's conference and a speaker made note of it. And I was talking to actually a Christian publisher who told me that Brené Brown is just huge, and she's so well known, and she seems to be more known than some of the Christian teachers out there for women. So I was just so fascinated because I had never really heard about her ever. All I know is that she's an author. So who is Brené Brown?
She's a research professor at the University of Houston. She holds a special chair, a chair endowed, in her name in Houston. And I think she's also she's also in a school of management as a professor and researcher. She self-styles, I guess that's the best word to say it, as a shame researcher. And her specialties are courage, vulnerability, empathy, shame, and leadership. And she crossed over from academia into mainstream popular culture probably about a decade ago or more. And yeah, she's a really, really influential person because she has academic cred, but she also speaks a very colloquial kind of in a very colloquial voice to ordinary women. So she's on the rise, and she's been well known to people who I think more pop culture women's voices for quite a long time, but now she's really known in her own right.
So I did mention that she's an author, and I'm not really familiar with any of her books before this article that you did. So what has she written and produced? What kind of materials are out there that she's done?
She has many books, at least 7, but 5 of them are New York Times bestsellers. So I think a very, very popular one is The Gifts of Imperfection. She's written about parenting and perfectionism and that kind of thing. She has Rising Strong and Daring Greatly. And I think the latest one is Braving the Wilderness. The one that I read, which was really good, was I Thought It Was Just Me, which is a lot of her research. And it's a really good, funny, but also packed with information and some of her research. That one is a little bit older. So, she's a prolific author. She has a Netflix special. She was featured on 60 Minutes recently. And the way that she went viral originally was with a TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability, I think it was called. And now she has a podcast. So right when the coronavirus hit the world, her podcast called Unlocking Us was released. And so she's been interviewing people, I think once a week or more on her own podcast. So her 2 TED Talks, they're really they're hugely viewed on Facebook and YouTube. And they really are great. You should watch them. They're only about 20 minutes long each. So you can see why she became so popular just from that original TED Talk.
I think some of the women that you've featured for us and written about, research for us, I feel like they, have reached popular cultural awareness when they have a New York Times profile piece done for them. And she has had one just in the last month. Just last month, she had a piece in the New York Times. So they kind of were following her, and just kind of, she's become a thing, I guess, because they're, mentioning her in their pages. So what kind of research does she do? You said that she has an endowed chair position at a university in Texas. And so what's her area of specialization?
She's a social worker. She has a BA, MA, and PhD in social work. And her work is, I would say, her research is sociological. It's interviews with individual women, mostly women. I guess she's done a little bit with men, but mostly she has honed in on the experiences of women in this particular culture. So she started out trying to understand how women could better connect with each other, and that led her very quickly into the area of shame and vulnerability. And so I think she spent about 6 years doing an intense study of shame and how it works in the lives of women. And from there, she's really branched out into leadership cultures. So I know she works as a consultant and helps big major corporations work better together, sort of work more functionally, get rid of the sort of embedded shame cultures that characterize a lot of business and industry in America. So it's the kind of research, it's a lot of interviews. It's not neurological or scientific in that sense, medical. It's one-on-one interviews with people, and then aggregating the data and trying to draw patterns out of what she's hearing people say.
So, as you mentioned, she is very popular, and that New York Times article mentioned the TED Talk you just told us about. The Power of Vulnerability has more than 60 million views. So that is pretty impressive for that kind of lecture. So why is she popular? I mean, she obviously is popular, but why are 60 million people caring to watch her TED Talk?
It is. I mean, it was a great TED Talk. I watched it several times. She's so warm and funny. She's very articulate. She talks very smoothly and very inviting. Her manner is so inviting. And then she has really put her finger on and described well how people, including me, feel a lot of the time, and what the kind of underlying motivations that seem to drive us together as a culture into certain kinds of behavior. So, she goes ahead and says this bad word, shame, and then she describes it in lots of different kinds of ways, and she's funny about it, which disarms, it's the sort of nightmare quality of it. And I think most of what she says is absolutely true. So you can, it's not surprising that it would be so popular, that it would continue to be viewed over and over again, because I think she's really hit on something critical about how we're functioning as a society. I just watched it again this morning, and she talks about how we numb ourselves is so relevant to right now. When you're feeling ashamed or insecure or inadequate, you numb. So everybody right now is doing that. Everybody's baking, for instance, and not feeling great about it, but it kind of is our main coping mechanism. So she's really on to something major in this culture.
Now, her other really popular TED Talk that you mentioned is Listening to Shame, but that was, I mean, she gave that TED Talk a long time ago. Was a 2012, so quite a few years ago, and yet it's garnered, again, almost 14 million views. And so what is she saying in that? How does she define shame?
So she's a pretty narrow, and I think that's good, a very clear definition of shame that she uses in most of her. I've come across it in most of the work that I've read from her. So she says shame is the intensely painful experience or feeling of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. So, and then she described that in her recent Netflix special. She said that shame is the feeling you would get if you walked out of a room that was filled with people who knew you and they start saying such hurtful things about you that you don't think you could ever walk back in and face them again. So she kind of she took from her interviews lots and lots of phrases that women in particular used about how to describe what shame was. It's a deep feeling of inadequacy. It's feeling like you're not enough, like you're outside, like you deserve other people's scorn and hatred, that it's like being in prison. It's feeling exposed. It's the dirty little secret that you have. It's this sort of massive, deep iceberg, really, of feeling that you can't easily name and separate yourself from and examine with any kind of clear idea of what it is or how to get away from it.
So she also talks about shame as a silent epidemic. So what does that mean? How and why is shame a silent epidemic?
So shame it's universal. There isn't a human culture or a human person who hasn't experienced shame. The people who don't experience shame are usually psychologically broken. They are not able to feel empathy, and in this way they're very dangerous people. So shame is a deep, universal experience of human people, and it does serve some purposes, which we can talk about eventually, but in its sort of very negative, virulent form, it wraps itself around, almost everything that you do can be inflected or shaped by shame. And you not even know it. That's where its silence comes in, because you will feel it biologically in your body. If you feel shamed, your heart rate will rise. You might get flushed. But you might not know. You wouldn't necessarily put the name shame on that experience, but it will then affect how you act the next time you're in that situation. So it's something that people really want to get away from, but there's no real good way to get away from it because we don't even know how to talk about it. I think this is where she's so effective. I was just, as a result of reading her, looking around my own Instagram feed, I think a lot of social media is sort of driven by internal sense of shame that people are trying to get away from. So if you sort of contrive to have a messy, love this mess kind of Instagram, but it's very carefully curated so that it's not messy, or you look amazing, but you say, I don't, didn't do my hair today or whatever. That's all sort of, you could easily trace that a little bit and get to shame because you're not comfortable with who you are, or you've been rejected in some way, or somebody found that you weren't enough, or you feel deeply inadequate. And so it's silent, and you don't want to name it to yourself, of course, but it's almost impossible to get away from the feeling and then not to communicate it to others. It's very, very easy to unintentionally communicate it. So it is silent. When you complain about perfectionism is really a result of shame. Body image issues, advertising is driven by shame. And I would say even parts of our economy, a lot of our economy is driven by feelings of deep not being enough.
You're listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest is Ann Kennedy, who has written an online exclusive feature article for the Christian Research Journal, and it's called, But What If It Is Me? The Work and Worldview of Brené Brown. You can read Ann's article for free online at our website, equip.org. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe to the Christian Research Journal. You can do that very easily at equip.org. And we'd also like to ask you to help support this podcast and help keep all of our content free on our website, including many of the online exclusive feature articles and reviews that we do for the journal on our website. And you can do that by giving us a tip if a subscription is not in your budget right now. A tip can be something really small, $3 or $5 or $10. And you can help us continue to produce this content. You can give us a tip by going to our website, equip.org. Just go over to the magazine tab at the drop-down menu, select Postmodern Realities Podcast. You can go to the landing page for this episode on Brené Brown or any episode, and you will find a link there to tip us. But actually, the best way that you can help us, which is completely free to you, except for maybe a couple minutes of your time, is to give us a review. When you rate or review this podcast, you help other people find this content, and you help our podcast come up higher in all the searches, especially on Apple Podcasts. So if you go there and you go to Apple Podcasts, just search for Postmodern Realities and really quickly give us a starred review. But if you have a few moments, I know you've been thinking about it for a long time, thinking, I need to do this, but could you please go ahead and do it? Give us a written review. It's really easy. Just write something about the podcast that you enjoy. And then you can also help us out by sharing this content on all of your social media feeds so other people can listen to this content and be encouraged. And we thank you for your support. You were just talking about Brené Brown's view of shame as a silent epidemic. Now, she also talks about vulnerability and courage. So what do those concepts and those words mean to her?
So vulnerability is kind of the underbelly of shame. It's the desire not, to sort of protect yourself from your innate and real vulnerabilities, that you would overcompensate in certain areas, and sort of shame would enter into those. If you were vulnerable with somebody and then they crushed you, that feeling is one of shame. But it's sort of the one side of shame, but it's also important because it's shame's antidote. So the only way, Brown says, the only way to be to deal with shame, to get rid of it or to cope with it, is to have a sense of worthiness, of love and belonging. You can't act in a vulnerable way and reach out towards other people if you don't feel like you're lovable and you're worthy of those connections. But it kind of feeds on itself, right? So, the more vulnerable you are, the capacity for connection, it becomes greater and greater. You'll probably have much better relationships and a much more successful and creative life, and you'll experience joy. But if you're vulnerable and then you're crushed to the earth, it gets harder and harder to stand up and be vulnerable again. So she connects vulnerability and courage together, that you have to be brave. You have to have the courage to be vulnerable, to reach out to other people, to take risks. She notes that our culture is so risk averse. We're so invested in safety as a culture that we just can't. We don't want to. We bubble wrap our children. We push them to succeed. We push ourselves to be perfect online, because we're afraid of anybody actually seeing what's there. So the way to sort of stop that horrible cycle is to be vulnerable, take risks with people, emotional risks. And then you'll have the benefits are love and creativity and joy. And I think, essentially that's true. The flip side of shame is vulnerability, and it does take courage to be vulnerable. I think that she has articulated that spot on. I don't think she goes far enough. I don't think she really gets to the real critical issue, but we have to talk about that as we go.
Well, I'd like to know how this contrasts to what Scripture says about shame. It seems like a lot of these women teachers have these similar themes in how they want to, accept themselves and feel better about themselves. But what does the Bible address in regards to shame?
So this is where I just had a deep sense of dissonance as I, interacted with her work, because, in some sense, it's really helpful to read her and then go back to the biblical narrative, because you can read the Bible and miss all of the shame. And there is a lot of shame in the Bible, tons and tons of shame. And it comes in right away in the first few chapters. Adam and Eve are naked and not ashamed. They don't have shame. And then they sin and they do have shame. And then that thread of shame, it just is woven along, I would say, the plan of salvation, the scarlet thread of redemption is sort of woven together with shame until you get to the cross. Through the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness and in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then the crucifixion itself, the Bible, I think, would say that shame is universal, but it is the natural consequence of sin. And so in that way, I would say it's not, I think we should be really careful about sort of just very quickly disassociating ourselves from shame and saying all shame is bad, or we just need to get rid of our shame, because there are reasons that we feel ashamed, and they're not just, they are that we are inadequate as human people, and that we're not good enough, we're not who we should be. And that feeling is, I mean, God says that that's real, and that's, I would say, in some sense good, because it reflects our true state. So to feel shamed as a human is a sort of a fair estimation of who we are in the eyes of God. So you can see, I even just saying that out loud, I feel a little bit bad. It's very countercultural to say that. One of the people that I read a lot as I was reading her, that was so helpful, and I hope to plug him again and again, but Kurt Thompson says that the very act of turning away, because he works through the biblical narrative of Adam and Eve, the very act of turning away, he would say, from God, while temporarily protecting and relieving us from our feeling and the gaze of the other person, ironically, simultaneously reinforces the very shame we are attempting to avoid. We do not necessarily realize this is happening. We just try to survive the moment. But this dance between hiding and feeling shame itself is like a tightening of the noose. We feel shame, and then we feel shame for feeling shame, and so shame begets itself. And that's really, he says, that's what happened in the garden. Adam and Eve turned away from God. They tried to cover themselves. Then they felt bad. They felt shame for doing that. That movement of turning away, of unraveling, of disconnection, is the state of humanity until you get to the cross. And so I think it's a really actually very rich human experience, and it actually deserves more theological thought than Brené Brown gives it in any of the places that she talks. And I think she just very quickly passes over the reasons that we feel shame and says that we just shouldn't, we need to get over them, we shouldn't have them.
So that's a good unpacking about what shame is in terms of the Word of God and how the Bible defines it. But what about the place of shame in cultural anthropology?
So this was also interesting to me because I grew up in a different culture than American culture, and one where shame is perhaps even more clear to people, that they're feeling and experiencing shame than we in America would know. They would use shame on purpose and admit that they were doing it in order to get the behavior that you need, that they would want from their children or even their parents. It's a way of coping with the culture and making sure that people behave themselves. And so I found actually Brown's very narrow discussion of shame. It didn't even get into the realm of the fact that shame is so effective, and it requires, I kind of was waiting for her to say this. Maybe she did and somewhere and I missed it. But the reason that we have shame is because we are social creatures, and you can't have shame in isolation. It's only in human community that you have shame. And so even in the unraveling that you experience as a result of shame, that very experience is also kind of the way that you come back even towards other people. You change the way you behave often because of shame. And the line between shame and guilt, I think, is pretty blurry. She says that shame is feeling bad for who you are, and guilt is feeling bad for what you've done. But I think you can have those simultaneously occur, because we do bad things because of who we are. So I don't think there should be a sharp line between those two things. But even if you look at shame and honor cultures around the world, or shame in Asia and Africa, I think you see that it's such a rich and deeply nuanced and culturally inflected experience that you wouldn't want to take everything you know from Brené Brown and think that you could go to another place and that any of it would make sense. It's her work is very fixed to this culture and in this point in history.
I would say just some of the things that you said about how she would define and view shame, and then your comments about different cultures makes a lot of sense, because I'm Asian, and the idea of shame and what that means, it's not individual like it is in America in terms of the self. It's like corporate. There's an idea of corporate shame. So I would say that some of the things that you said sounded very, American to me. So how does Brené Brown, how does she think that we should deal with shame?
So she would say that um, you should get rid of shame as much as you can, but that you can't get rid of it. So you want to name, and this is very helpful actually, if you do feel that are sort of out of sorts is a lot in different areas in your life. It's helpful to stop, consider the experience that you've just had, and figure out if what you're feeling is actually shame. And then saying that out loud to yourself. She calls it speaking shame. I had a really hard time with that because it felt to me like somebody who was saying shameful things to another person, but it's actually you naming the shame that you're feeling just to yourself. Because once you've identified it, then you can begin to sort out the triggers that you have whenever you feel shame. You'll it will happen to you again. So it's great if you can identify it and minimize the effect each time. And then if you can speak that, that will help you stop and then really work on building empathy with the person who's shamed you or with other people who might be experiencing shame. And that's just absolutely critical. If you can't have feelings of empathy towards people, you can't move back towards them when you've been hurt. And so there's kind of a process. You speak shame, you build empathy, which takes courage. You have to sort of gird up your loins and be willing to tackle the feeling of hurt that you're having. You can't just numb it and walk away. And then you have to choose to be vulnerable over and over and over again. And if you kind of go through her steps, she names them in a lot of different places, you should be able to gradually build a capacity to deal with shame in a functional way so that you're not crushed by it.
So she also talks about something called shame resilience. What does Brené Brown mean by shame resilience?
So she would say, there's a continuum. You can't get away from shame. But you can have, if shame is one end of sort of continuing, empathy is the other end. You kind of move back and forth between them. And you want to develop the ability to move away from the shame end and towards the empathy end, which will, help you get away from it. But you can't get away from it. You cannot rid yourself of shame. You can only become resilient to the experience of it. You can only become stronger so that you're not knocked over. I feel like the kind of what she's describing, like you're a tree, you're going to bend low before shame and then hopefully snap back up. But you're going to have that happen to you over and over again. You're never going to get rid of shame. And trying to get rid of shame totally is not a good use of your time.
She has also interacted with some of the other women that you've covered for us in their teaching. So recently, Brené Brown had on her podcast, which is called Unlocking Us, she's had Jen Hatmaker on, and then she has also had a lady on called Glenon Doyle. And you're going to actually review for us Glenon Doyle Melton's latest book. So who is Glenon Doyle Melton, and how does Brené Brown kind of resonate with her?
So Glenon Doyle Melton, I feel, is kind of like the poster child, I would say, of what would happen to you if you wholeheartedly followed Brené Brown's approach to shame without any Christian check on you. Like, I think it'd be fine for Christians to read and interact with Brown's material and all the stuff she said, I think I was very helped. But if you do not filter what she's saying through a biblical worldview or grid, you can look at the life of Brené Brown, because I feel like she fully embodies what happens when you do what Brené Brown says to do without the check of the scripture over you. So Glenon Doyle Melton had a great popular blog called Momastery way back in the day that I used to read. And then her husband had an affair, and then she ended up leaving him. This latest book that I'm reading now is her fourth memoir. She's written 4 memoirs. The first one, I think, was about getting out of addiction. She had addiction and bulimia and issues like that. I don't know what the middle 2 were, but this one is largely about how she took up with the world famous American female soccer star, and the 2 of them are in a lesbian marriage together. And Glenon Doyle Melton justifies her leaving her husband and becoming lesbian largely, I think, on the kind of the self. You need to prioritize yourself. You need to get rid of the shame that you're feeling, and you name your shame, you get rid of your shame, you develop shame resilience, and at a pretty superficial level, and you end up justifying who you are without any input from God at all. So I think it was one of the recent. They both of these people claim to be Christian. I think it was sort of heartbreaking. Brené Brown claims to be an Episcopalian, and I don't know what Glenon Doyle Melton is now, but they both kind of throw the word Christian around. But they would say, like, Brené Brown says things like, faith is believing in things we can't see and can't understand. That's what faith and religion is. Faith minus vulnerability equals extremism. We make certain that which is uncertain. Religion, which is the belief in faith and mystery, has gone to I'm right and you're wrong. So that's her take on religion and spirituality. And so she advocates a very, very self-centered world where you are the measure, your feelings are the measure, and you can be vulnerable, but you don't need to be vulnerable with people who you don't value or you don't think should have the right to speak into your own life. So it's actually pretty dangerous. If you're going to read Brené Brown, you should be really, really careful about what you're taking from her, because she really does excise the gospel.
So explain to us a little bit about the stories we tell ourselves. What is that? What are stories we tell ourselves?
So, we all have an interpretive grid that we put over our lives. And I actually think this is really helpful, because you can stop and say to yourself, gosh, I'm really angry with this person, and they don't love me, and they looked at me cross-eyed, and obviously they hate me, and I'm never going to talk to them again. Or you can stop and say, that person might be having a bad day, and maybe they didn't even notice I was here. And so I'm going to back up and see if I can work this out a little bit and figure out if maybe I'm telling myself a story about that person or myself that's not objectively true. And I think that's a really helpful thing that you can do, you can take from her, especially since Kurt Thompson in The Soul of Shame, he talks about that shame is the story that we tell, but you can take it beyond that. It's also one of the stories that you can tell yourself is a story that God tells you about why it is that you're feeling shame. What is your relationship to other people? How can you stop and orient yourself in such a way that you actually can pivot away from yourself and towards another? And I think that if you had this phrase, the story we tell ourselves, or the story you tell yourself in your head, but you used it not to tell the story that Brené Brown is telling you, but to tell yourself the story of Jesus, it would be the little shock that you need to get out of the selfishness, I think, that is at the core of shame, and would actually help you pass the thing that she advocates, which is to double down on yourself. I think rather you must forget yourself and look towards Jesus and others in order to be rid of shame.
So obviously her way of dealing with shame, as you said, is not a biblical worldview at all. She's not dealing with biblical truth and how she sees shame. So how does God in the Bible deal with shame? that's really been with us, as you said, since Genesis chapter 3.
So I think the Bible is so much greater than any human system that would deal with shame, because God doesn't want us to become resilient to shame. He wants us to feel our shame and then give it to him, and he takes it away. He actually takes our shame onto himself, and on the cross is shamed. He is naked and ashamed on the cross in our place, so that Christians actually can feel a deep sense of shame and then be delivered of it. Not that they get rid of it even on their own power, but that God actually delivers the Christian out of his or her shame and hides that person in himself. Paul talks about us being hidden in Christ. We're covered with Christ's own righteousness. We're covered with his blood, his garments, his perfection, his beauty. And so we actually do, as Christians, have the power to do what Brown advocates, which is to be vulnerable, to take risks. Not because you can just take a risk, which I think actually the desire for safety is an important and true desire. And it's not helpful to say to people, well, just take a risk, don't worry about it. There's actually a foundation, a way that you can take a risk, and that's because Christ has rescued you and covered you out of your shame. He actually takes the experience of shame from some people. I've had this happen to me where I felt shamed and I begged God to remove that feeling from me, and he did. He healed. It's healing. It's not resilience. It's actual true healing that penetrates all the way to the core of the person. So I found myself really grieved by this idea that as Christians, or as anybody, you would, in your own power, have to circle round and round yourself, trying to get rid of a feeling that actually is supposed to drive you to God for your good, and that he takes it from you. He saves you. And then, in heaven, the perfect community that was in the garden, in the new heavens and the new earth, we will be with God and with each other without this constant unraveling. So I think that the biblical narrative is so rich, especially when you come to it with sort of shame as one of the lenses that you're going to use. You will see the incredible mercy and grace of God in a way that really blows your mind. And again, I really recommend Kurt Thompson's book. He works through the crucifixion narrative and how God deals with shame, and in the person, in the mind, in the neurobiology of the Christian can be changed through the gospel, really, as people are healed.
So what do you think, if we leave out the gospel, why will it be impossible for us to effectively deal with shame? I mean, in addition to not realizing that the gospel covers our shame and that we are shameful, that we're sinners. I mean, how could you not really deal with shame if you tried to follow what Brené Brown is advocating?
I think the main way that you won't be able to deal is that you'll end up with incoherence, because you can't have vulnerability when you prioritize, when you put yourself at the center of everything, which is what she advocates at the same time that she says not to do that. She says, to care about other people, but then also mainly care about yourself. You end up with a deep incoherence when you double down on the self. You actually increase the sense of disconnection. So she has a very secular view of the self. In the Netflix special, she said, just leapt out at me, she said, I engineered smallness in my life. It wasn't worth it to me to step into my power and play big because I didn't know if I could physically withstand the criticism. And then she went on and said, you can't take criticism and feedback from people who are not going to be brave with their lives. And then you share with people who have earned the right to hear your story. So she says those things, which to me, that's actually not risky. If you make people prove themselves to you, you're not taking any risks. She says that, and then she says, vulnerability is the path back to each other, but we're so afraid to get on it. Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't say that you need to live into your true self and people need to prove themselves to you, and then say, take risks. I think people hear loud and clear that they are the most important thing and they should never risk themselves. Problem is, if you want to take a risk, you need to know that you're safe. And the way to know that you're safe is to be safe in Jesus. Then you can die. You don't have to worry about engineering anything in your life. You can die safely because Jesus has you forever, and he gives you the worthiness that she claims you need in order to be rid of shame. You can't generate feelings of worthiness. You need an external worthiness to come to you in Christ. I felt like her discussion about building shame resilience was like doubling down on a shameful version of yourself. It is honestly the worst idea that I can think of. And it is producing a very fractured, ruinous society because we're all doing what she says we should do, but she's complaining about the results of what's happening. And I don't think you can have it both ways. You have to submit to the reality of a shameful existence. You have to be covered in Christ, and then you can have the safety and the power to come back towards each other and to receive the love and connection that you need from other human people.
Well, finally, I want to end on a lighter note and have my usual fun rapid fire questions for Anne. So, Anne, you mentioned earlier that you grew up in a different place. I know you grew up in Africa. So is there a specific type of African dish or food that is a favorite of yours?
Yes, I love this sort of, it's not porridge, but it's like this firm, I don't know if East Africans knew what ugali was. In West Africa, it's called toe. You grind up millet and you boil it down until you can mold it in a bowl, and then you break off pieces of it and you dip it in like a green slimy okra sauce. And it's so delicious. And I heard recently that people are not eating toe anymore because they're modernizing and they're eating rice all the time. And I was just devastated. I'm against modernization.
And what is your favorite season of the year? Because I know you live in a place where there are seasons.
Well, right now I am loving spring, even though it keeps freezing at night. But I think autumn is my favorite because I'm a pessimist.
Cats or dogs?
Ooh, gosh. I mean, I really do love my dogs, but we have this cat, and we're pouring all of our emotional trauma into this cat, all 10 of us. And so I think I'm going to have to go with cat today.
And do you prefer a physical book or an ebook?
Physical.
Well, thanks, Anne, for being a guest on the Postmodern Realities podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest has been Anne Kennedy, who has written an online exclusive article for the Christian Research Journal, and it's called "But What If It Is Me? The Work and Worldview of Brené Brown." And you can read her article free online at our website, equip.org. We'd like to hear from you, so connect with us on social media. Like the Bible Answer Man Facebook page and follow CRI, Christian Research Journal, Hank Hanegraaff, and the Bible Answer Man on Twitter. And please subscribe to the Bible Answer Man channel on YouTube. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Postmodern Realities podcast on iTunes, and please rate and review our podcast. When you rate and review our podcast, it helps others see our content. And please share this episode on your social media accounts. Be sure you tune in daily to the Bible Answer Man broadcast hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff, who answers your questions live on air. To ask Hank a question, call 888-ASK-HANK, Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. In addition, head to iTunes and subscribe to Hank Unplugged, Hank's audio podcast. Follow Hank Off the Grid, where he has in-depth conversations with some of the brightest minds discussing topics you care about. So until our next Christian Research Journal author conversation, thanks for listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast.